But it was 2 years since we'd seen each other, and this meeting was therefore a happy surprise for both of us. I put off my trip to Brussa, and even had to give up my plan of going straight to the Caucasus, in view of the prince's request that I should accompany to Russia a young woman on whose account this trip to Ceylon had also been temporarily abandoned. That same day I went to the bath, tidied myself up, and had supper with the prince. While telling me about himself, he related with great animation, and very vividly, the story of the young woman whom I had agreed to take to Russia. As from my point of view this woman subsequently became remarkable in every respect, I wish not only to repeat her story as it was recounted by Prince Lubovedsky, but also to tell something about her later life, based on my personal meetings with her and my own observations, the more so since the original manuscript, in which I had written a more complete description of the life of this remarkable woman, under the title of Confessions of a Polish Woman, has remained in Russia among my many other manuscripts, the fate of which is still entirely unknown to me. Vivitskaya. The prince told me the following story. A week ago, I was leaving for Ceylon on a ship of the volunteer fleet. I was already on board. Among those who were seeing me off was an attache of the Russian embassy, who in the course of conversation drew my attention to a certain passenger, a venerable-looking old man. "You see that old man?" he said. "Can anyone possibly believe that he is an important agent of the white slave traffic? Nevertheless, it is so." This was said in passing. There was a great bustle on board, and many people had come to see me off. Having no time to pay much attention to the old man, I quite forgot what the attaché had told me. The boat started. It was morning. The weather was fine. I was sitting on deck reading. Near me, romping about, was Jack. Jack was the prince's fox terrier who accompanied him everywhere. A pretty girl passed and patted Jack. Then she brought him some sugar. But Jack never takes anything from anyone without my permission, so he cocked his head at me as if to ask, "May I?" I nodded and said in Russian, "Yes, you may." It turned out that the young woman also spoke Russian, and a conversation was started with the usual questions as to where each was going. She told me that she was going to Alexandria to take a place as governess in the family of the Russian consul. During our conversation, the old man whom the attaché had pointed out to me came on deck and called the young woman. When they had gone off together, I suddenly recalled what had been said about this old man, and his acquaintance with this girl seemed to me suspicious. I began to think, searching my memory. I knew the consul in Alexandria, and as far as I could remember, he could not have needed a governess. My suspicions increased. Our boat had to stop at several ports, and at the first stop in the Dardanelles I sent 2 telegrams, one to the consul at Alexandria asking whether he needed a governess, and the other to the consul at Salonika, where the boat was to stop next. I also confided my suspicions to the captain. In short, when we arrived at Salonika, what I had suspected was confirmed, and it became clear that this girl was being carried off under false pretenses. I found the girl appealing, and resolved to rescue her from the danger menacing her, to take her back to Russia, and not to start off again for Ceylon until I had arranged something for her. We left the boat together at Salonika, and the same day boarded another which was returning to Constantinople. As soon as we arrived, I wished to send her back to her home, but it turned out that she had no one to whom she could go. That is why I've been delayed here. Her history is rather unusual. She is Polish, born in the Volyn province, and as a child lived not far from Ravno, on the estate of a certain count for whom her father was superintendent. There were 2 brothers and 2 sisters in the family. The mother died when they were all quite young, and they were brought up by an old aunt. When this girl, Vivitskaya, was 14 and her sister 16, their father died. At that time, one brother was studying somewhere in Italy preparing for the Catholic priesthood. The other had turned out to be a great scoundrel. He had run away from college the year before and was in hiding, so it was rumored, somewhere in Odessa. At the death of the father, the two sisters and their aunt were compelled to leave the estate since a new superintendent had been taken on. They moved to Ravno. Shortly afterward, the old aunt also died. The situation of the sisters became difficult. On the advice of a distant relative, they sold their belongings and moved to Odessa, where they entered a vocational school to learn to be dressmakers. Vivitskaya was very beautiful, and in contrast to her elder sister, frivolous. She had a great many admirers, among them a commercial traveler who seduced her and took her off to St. Petersburg. As she had quarreled with her sister, she took with her share of their heritage. In St. Petersburg, the commercial traveler robbed and deserted her. She found herself penniless in a strange city. After many struggles and misfortunes, she finally became the mistress of an old senator. But he soon became jealous of some young student and turned her out. She then got into a respectable family of a certain doctor who trained her to extend his practice by a very original method. The doctor's wife had met her in the garden in front of the Alexandria theater, had sat down beside her, and had persuaded her to come and live with them. She then taught her the following maneuver. She was to walk along the Newski, and when accosted by a man, she was not to put him off, but allow him to accompany her home. Give him diplomatic encouragement, and leave him at the door. He would, of course, ask the porter about her, and would be told that she was the companion of a certain doctor's wife. As a result of this procedure, the doctor would acquire new patients, who invented some kind of ailment merely to get into his apartment in the hope of a pleasant meeting. Insofar as I have had time to study the nature of Vivitskaya, observed the prince with conviction, she must have been subconsciously depressed all the time by such a life, and only dire need could have constrained her to resort to it. One day when she was walking on the Nevsky for the purpose of picking up patients, she quite unexpectedly met her younger brother, whom she had not seen for several years. He was very well dressed and gave the impression of being rich. This meeting with her brother brought a ray of light into her cheerless life. It appeared that he had some kind of business in Odessa and abroad. When he learned that she was not particularly well off, he proposed that she should come to Odessa, where he had many connections and could arrange something good for her. She consented. On her arrival in Odessa, her brother found her a very good situation with excellent prospects, governess in the family of the Russian consul in Alexandria. Several days later, her brother introduced her to a very distinguished-looking old man, who happened to be going to Alexandria and who agreed to accompany her. And so one fine day, accompanied by this apparently reliable gentleman, she went on board the boat and started on her way. What followed, you know. The prince told me he believed that only circumstances and the unhappy conditions of her family life had brought her to the brink of ruin, that her nature was unspoiled, and that she had many excellent qualities. He had therefore decided to interest himself in her life and put her on the right path. For this, said the prince, I must first of all send the unfortunate girl to my sister on my estate in Tambov province, so that she may have a good rest, and after that we will see. Knowing the prince's idealism and kindness, I took a very skeptical attitude towards his project, and considered that in this case his efforts would be in vain. I even thought then, what falls from the wagon is lost. without having even set eyes on Vivitskaya, there arose in me, for some reason or other, something like hatred for her. But I could not refuse the prince, and with a reluctant heart consented to accompany this, as I then thought, worthless woman. I first saw her several days later when we boarded the boat. She was above middle height, very beautiful, with a good figure and brown hair. She had kind, honest eyes, which sometimes became diabolically cunning. It seems to me that the ties of history must have been of the same type. At the first sight of her, she aroused in me a dual feeling towards her, now of hate, now of pity. And so I went with her to the Tambov province. She stayed with the prince's sister, who became very fond of her, and took her abroad where they lived for long periods, particularly in Italy. Little by little, under the influence of the prince's sister and the prince himself, she grew interested in their ideas, which soon became an integral part of her essence. She began to work on herself in earnest, and anyone who met her, even if only once, could feel the result of that work. After I had taken her to Russia, I did not see her again for a long time. It was, it seems to me, at least 4 years later that I met her, quite by chance, with the sister of Prince Yuri Lubovedsky, in Italy, in the following peculiar circumstances. Once I was in Rome, as always pursuing my aim, and since my money was fast running out, I followed the advice of 2 young Aissors whose acquaintance I had made there, and with their help began to shine shoes on the street. It could not be said that my business went very well at first, and so to increase my income, I decided to run it on new and original lines. For this purpose I ordered a special armchair under which, hidden from onlookers, I placed an Edison phonograph. To this I attached a rubber tube with earpieces on the end, in such a way that whoever sat in the armchair could put them to his ears, and I would then unnoticeably set the machine in motion. In this way my clients could listen to the Marseillaise or an operatic air while I shined their shoes. In addition to this, I fastened to the right arm of the chair a little tray of my own make, on which I put a glass, a decanter of water, vermouth, and some illustrated magazines. Thanks to this, my business became more than successful, and lira, not centesimi, began to pour in. Rich young tourists paid particularly well. Curious gapers would stand round me all day long, most of them waiting for their turn to sit in the armchair, so that while I shined their shoes they could enjoy something never before seen or heard of, and incidentally show themselves off to others who hung around all day, the same conceited fools as themselves. In this crowd I often noticed a certain young lady. She attracted my attention because she seemed quite familiar to me, but for lack of time I did not look at her closely. One day I happened to hear her voice, as she said in Russian to the elderly woman with her, "I bet it is he." And I became so intrigued that, managing somehow to get free of my clients, I went straight up to her and asked her in Russian, "Tell me, please, who are you? It seems to me that I've seen you somewhere." "I am the person," she replied, "whom you once so hated that the flies which came into the sphere of the radiations of your hate perished. If you recall Prince Lubovedsky, then perhaps you will also recall the unfortunate girl you accompanied from Constantinople to Russia." I then immediately recognized her, and also the elderly woman with her, the prince's sister. From that day, until they left for Monte Carlo, I spent every evening with them at their hotel. A year and a half after this meeting, accompanied by Professor Skridlov, Vivitskaya came to the meeting place for one of our big expeditions, and from then on was a permanent member of our itinerant band. To illustrate the character of the inner world of Vivitskaya, this woman, who had stood on the brink of moral ruin, and who later, thanks to the aid of persons with ideas who chanced to cross the path of her life, became, I may boldly say, such as might serve as an ideal for every woman. I will confine myself here to telling about only one aspect of her many-sided inner life. Among other interests, she was particularly drawn to the science of music. The seriousness of her attitude toward this science may be shown clearly by a conversation we had during one of the expeditions of our group. On this journey through the center of Turkestan, thanks to special introductions, we stayed for 3 days in a certain monastery not accessible to everyone. The morning we left this monastery, Vivitskaya was as pale as death, and her arm, for some reason or other, was in a sling. For a long time she could not mount her horse by herself, and another comrade and I had to help her. When the whole caravan was under way, I rode beside Vivitskaya, a little behind all the others. I very much wanted to know what had happened to her, and questioned her insistently. I thought that perhaps one of our comrades had acted the brute, and had dared in some way to insult her, a woman who had become sacred for us all. And I wished to find out who the scoundrel was, in order, without dismounting and without words, to shoot him down like a partridge. To my questions, Vivitskaya finally replied that the cause of her state was, as she expressed it, that damned music, and she asked me if I remembered the music of the night before last. I did indeed remember how all of us, sitting in some corner of the monastery, had almost sobbed, listening to the monotonous music performed by the brethren during one of their ceremonies. And although we had talked about it afterwards for a long time, none of us could explain the reason for it. After a little pause, Vivitskaya began to talk of her own accord, and what she said about the cause of her strange state took the form of a long story. I do not know whether it was because the scenery through which we were riding that morning was indescribably glorious, or whether there was some other reason. But what she then told me with such sincerity, I still remember almost word for word even after all these years. Each of her words was so strongly imprinted on my brain that it seems to me I hear her at this moment. She began as follows. I do not remember whether there was anything in music that touched me inwardly when I was still quite young, but I do remember very well how I thought about it. Like everybody else, I did not wish to appear ignorant, and in praising or criticizing a piece of music, I judged it only with my mind. Even when I was quite indifferent to the music I heard, if my opinion was asked about it, I expressed a view, for or against, according to the circumstances. Sometimes, when everyone praised it, I spoke against it, using all the technical words I knew, so that people should think I was not just anyone, but an educated person who could discriminate in everything. And sometimes I condemned it in unison with others, because I thought that if they criticized it, there was doubtless something in it which I did not know about, for which it should be criticized. But if I praised a piece of music, it was because I assumed that the composer, whoever he might be, having been occupied with this matter all his life, would not let any composition see the light if it did not deserve it. In short, in either praising or blaming, I was always insincere with myself and with others, and for this I felt no remorse of conscience. Later, when that good old lady, the sister of Prince Lubovedsky, took me under her wing, she persuaded me to learn to play the piano. Every well-educated, intelligent woman, she said, should know how to play this instrument. In order to please the dear old lady, I gave myself up wholly to learning to play the piano. And in 6 months I did indeed play so well that I was invited to take part in a charity concert. All our acquaintances, present, praised me to the skies and expressed astonishment at my talent. One day, after I had been playing, the prince's sister came over to me and very seriously and solemnly told me that, since God had given me such a talent, it would be a great sin to neglect it, and not let it develop to the full. She added that, as I had begun to work on music, I should be really educated in this field, and not just play like any Mary Smith, and she therefore thought that I should first of all study the theory of music, and, if necessary, even take an examination. From that day on, she began sending for all kinds of books on music for me, and she even went to Moscow herself to buy them. Very soon the walls of my study were lined with enormous bookcases filled to overflowing with all kinds of musical publications. I devoted myself very zealously to studying the theory of music, not only because I wished to please my benefactress, but also because I myself had become greatly attracted to this work, and my interest in the laws of music was increasing from day to day. My books, however, were of no help to me, for nothing whatsoever was said in them either about what music is or on what its laws are based. They merely repeated in different ways information about the history of music, such as that our octave has 7 notes, but the Chinese octave had only 5, that the harp of the ancient Egyptians was called a tabuni, and the flute a mem, that the melodies of the ancient Greeks were constructed on the basis of different modes such as the Ionian, the Phrygian, the Dorian, and various others, that in the 9th century polyphony appeared in music, having at first so cacophonic an effect that there was even a case of premature delivery of a pregnant woman, who suddenly heard in church the roar of the organ playing this music, that in the 11th century a certain monk, Guido d'Arezzo, invented solfege, and so on and so forth. Above all, these books gave details about famous musicians and how they had become famous. They even recorded what kind of neckties and spectacles were worn by such and such composers. But as to what music is, and what effect it has on the psyche of people, nothing was said anywhere. I spent a whole year studying this so-called theory of music. I read almost all my books and finally became definitely convinced that this literature would give me nothing. But my interest in music continued to increase. I therefore gave up all my reading and buried myself in my own thoughts. One day, out of boredom, I happened to take from the prince's library a book entitled The World of Vibrations, which gave my thoughts about music a definite direction. The author of this book was not a musician at all, and from the contents it was obvious that he was not even interested in music. He was an engineer and mathematician. In one place in his book he mentioned music merely as an example for his explanation of vibrations. He wrote that the sounds of music are made up of certain vibrations, which doubtless act upon the vibrations which are also in a man. And this is why a man likes or dislikes this or that music. I at once understood this, and I fully agreed with the engineer's hypothesis. All my thoughts at that time were absorbed by these interests, and when I talked with the prince's sister, I always tried to turn the conversation to the subject of music and its real significance. As a result, she herself became interested in this question, and we pondered over it together, and also began to make experiments. The prince's sister even bought several cats and dogs and other animals specifically for this purpose. We also began inviting some of our servants, served them tea, and for hours on end played the piano for them. At first our experiments produced no result, but once, when we had as guests 5 of our servants and 10 peasants from the village formerly owned by the prince, half of them fell asleep while I was playing a waltz of my own composition. We repeated this experiment several times, and each time the number of those who fell asleep increased. And although the old lady and I, making use of all kinds of principles, composed other music intended to have different effects on people, Nevertheless, the only result we attained was to put our guests to sleep. Finally, from constantly working on music and thinking about it, I grew so tired and thin that one day, when the old lady looked at me attentively, she became alarmed, and, on the suggestion of an acquaintance, hastened to take me abroad. We went to Italy, and there, distracted by other impressions, I gradually began to recover. It was only after 5 years had passed, when we went on our Pamir, Afghanistan expedition, and witnessed the experiments of the mono-psych brotherhood, that I began to think about the effect of music, but not from the same enthusiasm as at first. In later years, whenever I remembered my first experiments with music, I could not help laughing at our naivety in giving such significance to the guests falling asleep from our music. It never entered our heads that these people fell asleep from pleasure, simply because they had gradually become to feel at home with us, and because it was very agreeable after a long day's work to eat a good supper, drink a glass of vodka offered them by the kind old lady, and sit in soft armchairs. After witnessing the experiments and hearing the explanations of the monopsych brethren, I later, on my return to Russia, resumed my experiments on people. I found, as the brothers had advised, the absolute la, according to the atmospheric pressure of the place where the experiment was to be carried out, and tuned the piano correspondingly, taking into consideration also the dimensions of the room. Besides this, I chose for the experiments people who already had in themselves the repeated impressions of certain chords, and I also took into consideration the character of the place and the race of each one present. Yet I could not obtain identical results, that is to say, I was not able by one and the same melody to evoke identical experiences in everyone. It cannot be denied that when the people present corresponded absolutely to the mentioned conditions, I could call forth at will in all of them laughter, tears, malice, kindness, and so on. But when they were of mixed race, or if the psyche of one of them differed just a little from the ordinary, the results varied, and try as I might, I could not succeed in evoking with one and the same music the mood I desired in all the people without exception. Therefore I gave up my experiments once more, and, as it were, considered myself satisfied with the results obtained. But here, the day before yesterday, this music, almost without melody, evoked the same state in all of us. People not only of different race and nationality, but even quite unlike in character, type, habits, and temperament. To explain this by the feeling of human herdness was out of the question, as we have recently experimentally proved that in all our comrades, thanks to corresponding work on themselves, this feeling is totally absent. In a word, there was nothing the day before yesterday that could have produced this phenomenon, and by which it could somehow or other be explained. And after listening to this music, when I returned to my room, there again arose in me the intense desire to know the real cause of this phenomenon, over which I had racked my brains for so many years. All night long I could not sleep, but only thought what could be the real meaning of it all. And the whole day yesterday I continued to think, and even lost my appetite. I neither ate nor drank anything. And last night I grew so desperate that either from rage or exhaustion, or from some other reason, I almost without knowing it bit my finger, and so hard that I nearly severed it from my hand. That is why my arm is now in a sling. It hurts so much that I can hardly sit on my horse. Her story touched me deeply, and with all my heart I wanted to help her in some way. In my turn, I told her how, a year earlier, I had happened to come across a phenomenon, also connected with music, which had greatly astonished me. I told her how, thanks to a letter of introduction from a certain great man, Father Evlisi, who had been my teacher in childhood, I had been among the Essenes, most of whom are Jews, and that by means of very ancient Hebraic music and songs, they had made plants grow in half an hour. And I described in detail how they had done this. She became so fascinated by my story that her cheeks even burned. The result of our conversation was that we agreed that as soon as we returned to Russia we would settle down in some town where, without being disturbed by anyone, we could really, seriously carry out experiments with music. After this conversation, for all the rest of the trip, Vivitskaya was her usual self again. In spite of her injured finger, she was the nimblest of all in climbing every cliff, and she could discern at a distance of almost 20 miles the monuments indicating the direction of our route. Vivitskaya died in Russia from a cold she caught while on a trip on the Volga. She was buried in Samara. I was there at the time of her death, having been called from Tashkent when she fell ill. Recalling her now, when I have already passed the halfway mark of my life, and have been in almost all countries and seen thousands of women, I must confess that I never have met and probably never will meet another such woman.